for you all to register and do what you need to do. I'm sure it wasn't ideal for some people, but Arlene, I do want you to acknowledge her, and she is representing our permanent staff, our temporary staff, and our student assistants. I would really like you to thank her. And enjoy the last excellent lecture.
Okay, I think we're off, yeah. Okay. Well, good morning, everybody. Are we all right with the sound? It doesn't sound quite right to me. Are we? Are you able to hear me at the back there? No, a few no's. We'll just see if we can get it right. That's better, isn't it? Well done. Thank you very much. Well, it's good to see you. Well, I would have seen you had the lights been on, but it's good to see you all. I sense you're there somewhere. And thank you for sticking it out for five days. In this course, no. We've been looking at, the course is titled, of course, How Artists See, and today we're going to look at something a little bit different from what we've done over the past 4 days, and that's namely look at how artists have reflected the societies in which they live. Now this, of course, is nothing new. We can go back to the 15th century, when Hieronymus Bosch, with his Haywain triptych here, had plenty to say about a society which in his eyes had gone awry. Everyone starts off pure in the left-hand panel in the Garden of Eden, and then gluttony and debauchery, the order of the day, and the consequence of that, of course, is ending up in hell. William Hogarth in the 18th century in Britain, in his Rake's Progress and Marriage à la Mode, had plenty to say about individuals who had gone astray, as you probably know. And then various devices have been used by artists, technical devices, to convey disquiet about society. And here we have the Belgian 19th century painter James Ensor, who uses masks to indicate hypocrisy. Another device is to make the images look a little bit spooky, and of course the master of that was Edvard Munch, who made not only the man at the bottom of the screen there look very spooky and destabilizing, but the very house itself looks ominous. Not only a house, and we can go back really 300 years earlier to El Greco, who made the city of Toledo look spooky in this rather disturbing image of that town. And then, of course, Vincent van Gogh. When you paint a picture of a church, you would think that this would be a serene place of calm, but that's just the opposite of what you see in Van Gogh's rendering here of Saint-Auvert-sur-Oise. The church looks decidedly spooky, doesn't it? And the reason for that is the technique he's used. Instead of strict vertical lines and angled lines, they're a little bit wavy. The other device he's used is to have a steep projection. The perspective is a little bit uncomfortable. You're just a bit too high there. It's looming down on you. And the other device, again, is his use of this acidic lime green color. And so the scene was set with ample precedent for Ernst Ludwig Kirchner, a young German artist, to borrow all those devices to reflect upon the disquieting scene that he found in his native Germany in the first decade of the 20th century. And in this picture of Mullendesenplatz in Berlin, Kirchner has depicted in his own way his take on society around him. You can see it owes something to Van Gogh, that sort of steep projection. Here we're even steeper, so it's even more destabilizing. And the acidic lime green is now this mustard and green. It's a very disturbing, uncomfortable color combination. And just to make the point that he's not happy about society, he's put in the foreground there at the bottom 2 tram cars which have collided. But the point of the painting is not to show a collision between 2 tram cars, but the total indifference of the people walking around on the pavement. Here he is, this young man, just 18 years old, trained as an architect, who had a mission in life. He was good-looking, quite ambitious for himself, rather hypersensitive, but he wanted to form a link in his contemporary art with the great traditions of the German Renaissance. So he viewed himself as an artist who was acting as a bridge between the glories of German art in the past and bringing Germany out of the complacency, bourgeois complacency, in which it had fallen during the 19th century. And he did so by forming a group. And we talked yesterday about if you want to advertise a group, give yourself a name, a logo. And he called his little group of like-minded young artists Die Brücke, or the bridge. And the bridge was linking the past to the present. And an example of that is this little montage I put together here. And his great hero was Lucas Cranach the Elder, whose Venus we can see on the left there, an elongated lady. And here is Kirchner's early 20th century picture of a similar Venus, a nude scene from the back and in the mirror, and I think you can see the link between the two. And interestingly, he's painted himself in the background there on the extreme right of the picture in the shadows in the blue. So this is what he was about. Here he's commenting on cabaret society in Berlin. And we have 3 young girls who've come from the provinces to the big city to earn some money as cabaret dancers. And you can tell they're new girls because they're looking a little bit coy. You can see the one in the front is wearing a sort of shift, which is a little bit transparent, a little bit covering. The one in the middle there is sort of arching over, covering her pubic area, trying to be a little bit modest, whereas the one at the back there is combing her hair so her breasts shouldn't be revealed. But of course that will all change once they become real cabaret girls, but this is how he depicted it. And he called this picture the Judgment of Paris. Remember how artists always feel they've got some legitimacy if they refer back to the classics. So here's a classic story of a Trojan prince who was called upon to judge among 3 Greek goddesses which was the most beautiful. And so here he's doing the same, picturing himself wearing a red dressing gown, smoking a cigarette in the background, judging these 3 young ladies. And here he's take on society that he sees in the street, the same acidic, disturbing green. 5 women looking in a shop window, 4 of them looking in the window, 1 looking away. They're looking haughty, they've got haughty looks on their faces, they're wearing these black sleek dresses which terminate in spikes, a bit like a witch, with their furs and their boas, looking very aloof. And I think he captures that essence very well. And here in painting Friedrichstrasse, Berlin, he has 2 prostitutes in blue. Do you see them standing there at the front on the left-hand side? Their eyes slit like cats on the prowl. And behind them, a whole phalanx of anonymous-looking men in tall black hats, black coats and trousers there, looking as though they've been stamped out by a machine. And gazing at them is a little whippet dog at the bottom. Can you see that? Who's just revealed as a passing car goes by and out of the picture on the right. And here in Potsdamer Platz, Berlin, he pictures 2 prostitutes standing on a traffic island, as if they're on a turntable on display. The one in blue, the law at the time, this is 1913, 1914, the law at the time was that prostitutes could ply their trade as long as they were respectably dressed if they were walking the streets. And there the one in blue most certainly is. And as from August 1914, when Germany was at war, prostitutes could still ply their trade with elegance, provided they dressed as war widows. And that explains the lady in black there, the sinister male figures looming up from the background. Kirchner wasn't the only one to be concerned about society. And here we have a painting by Emil Nolde, quite a bit older than the youngsters, and temporarily a member of the Die Brücke group, who borrowed from James Ensor the mask-like faces. Can you see at the back there? And this painting he calls Joseph's dream. This isn't the Old Testament Joseph, but this is Mary's husband, Joseph, from the New Testament. And the dream, of course, was that Herod was planning to kill the baby Jesus, and that they had to repair post-haste to Egypt. And this is Joseph's dream, but again, the sort of spookiness that you can see coming through. But Nolde was very prescient in that he knew what lay ahead for Germany. And in this searing woodcut called the Prophet, he was only too aware of the fate that was lying ahead for Europe in 1914. The build-up to the First World War was a decade in coming. Germany had become alarmed at the Entente Cordiale between Britain and France in 1904, and consequently allied itself with Austro-Hungary to provide a buffer against what they felt was going to be British and French domination of Europe. The British Royal Navy, of course, was the dominant sea power in the world at the time. And to build up the Navy, Admiral Tirpitz was commissioned with building battleships to rival the Royal Navy and even to supersede them. And the build-up then continued in that way until 1914, when Archduke Ferdinand of Austro-Hungary was visiting Bosnia-Herzegovina, the city of Sarajevo. And why he was there was because Austro-Hungary had sort of gobbled up Bosnia-Herzegovina into its own greater empire, whereas previously it had been closely allied with Serbia. And consequently, the Serbians were very restless and regarded this as an insult that the Austro-Hungarian pretender to the Austro-Hungarian throne should be visiting Sarajevo. And the Serbian activists were determined to assassinate Archduke Ferdinand, which they, Ferdinand, which they did. One Serbian activist hurled a bomb at the car just as the Archduke was returning with his wife Sophie to the vehicle with the chauffeur already at the wheel, as you can see there. The bomb bounced off the bonnet of the car and exploded harmlessly in the street. It was obviously a highly alarming situation. The chauffeur sped off down a side street where, waiting for him purely by chance, was another Serbian activist, Gavrilo Princip. And Gavrilo Princip opened fire on the Archduke and his wife, killing the Archduke instantly. And you can see on the left there, there's a picture of him wearing his uniform buttoned across the chest there, you can see with little stars on his collar. And there's the uniform in the museum now, indicating where he was shot. And this, of course, was the fuse that started to fizzle, leading a few weeks later to the First World War. And it was a highly complex political business. Serbia was, of course, the prime suspect in the assassination of the Archduke, and the Serbians were fearful that Austro-Hungary was going to invade Serbia as a reprisal. There's been a long-standing link, of course, between Russia and the Serbian people, both Slavic in origin, and alarmed that Austro-Hungary was going to go on a greater expansionist move through Europe, Russia mobilized. And as a consequence of Russia's military mobilization, Germany now became alarmed, realizing it was sandwiched between Russia and France, who were allied with the United Kingdom. Anticipating trouble was just days away, Germany launched a preemptive strike into France, its troops passing through Belgium, which in turn triggered a separate alliance between Britain and Belgium, which brought Britain into the war. And thus the scene was set for a 4-year conflagration, which essentially ended in stalemate, with the deaths of 9 million soldiers on all sides and 7 million civilians. When war was declared, there was war fever. Jingoism was rife, and this is a photograph taken at a recruiting station in Britain shortly after war was declared, and this was wonderful. We're going to show the Germans what's what. And what's interesting, you can see in this photograph, there are 2 types of headgear. Among the flat caps of the workers who thronged to the call for military service, there were also a number of middle and upper class straw boaters. The same picture could have been reproduced in Germany and perhaps even in Russia. But disillusion soon set in. As the troops were in their fresh uniforms being driven up to the front in Europe, crossing the Channel, they met a stream of wounded soldiers coming back. Others were lying on stretchers, waiting for ambulances to take them to care. The more severely wounded were shipped back home, so the people at home began to learn very quickly exactly what was going on. And of course, more and more soldiers were being killed. It was essentially a stalemate for 4 years, and much of the time was spent gaining a yard of ground here from one trench to another. The men would go over the top, go across the plain field to a trench of the enemy a couple of 100 yards away, capture the trench, and then within the week, the whole process would be reversed. And it was estimated that for every yard gained in trench warfare, 100 men were killed. The cause of the savagery was, of course, the newly invented machine gun. And all generals fight the last war. In the last war, you just went line abreast and charged. This was now 1914, so you dug trenches, but the same principle applied. The men went over the top at the call, and of course were mown down by the machine guns. Even more feared than the machine guns was poison gas, which in 1915 was introduced by the Germans and very quickly taken up by the Allies. More feared than actually a good tactical weapon, because as often as not, the gas would blow back across the trenches from which it had been launched. Those who were in the line of the gas, however, Claude, died a painful asphyxiating death very rapidly. And those that survived that had developed severe blistering of the skin, and many became blind. As you can see here, a whole line of blind soldiers seeking treatment. The gas masks with which they were issued were only very partially effective. On both sides, war photographers were sent across to record the event for posterity. And here we have a war photographer on the British side recording the appearance of what was known at the time as Chateau Wood in the after a 1 week battle of the Battle of Ypres, in which a new weapon was launched, an artillery shell which exploded in the air. And as a consequence of that, the object was to kill as many people with the shrapnel as possible, whereas a ground-loading one would have a ground-exploding one would have a much more limited kill field, to use a terrible word. And that's the explanation for why the trees are all left standing, but all their tops have gone. And this is air blast from the shells. The British also sent war artists. And here the celebrated English landscape painter Paul Nash was sent across to record after the Battle of Ypres the same scene that we saw in the photograph there, but in a somewhat romanticized way, I think you would agree. And ironically, he called this painting, "We Are Changing the World." The capturing on film or painting of casualties was a no-no. Yet 1 or 2 of casualties were photographed, and here you can see stretcher bearers carrying a casualty, sinking almost up to their thighs in the oozing mud. Another landscape painter, Gilbert Rogers, was sent across, and he captured a dead stretcher bearer. You can see the Red Cross emblem on his arm there. But he's rendered him in such a way, it isn't a horrific painting, it's a heroic painting. He's caught in the evening sun, the mud on his clothing there, reflecting the sun, looking for all the world as if he'd been cast as a hero in bronze. And this was the mentality. The reality, of course, was completely different. This is Lieutenant Lumley on the left, before he was caught in a fire which burnt his face almost entirely. And on the right, his appearance after multiple plastic surgical procedures. If you want to know what the war was like, I can recommend to you a book, an account from a German infantryman who survived the war, wounded 4 or 5 times, Ernst Junger, and his book translated into English is called Storm of Steel. and it is absolutely harrowing, and he's just a loyal soldier who just does his duty, and all I can say is you really must read it. But if you want a more harrowing version still of what it was like to be at the front, all you need to do is to read William Owen's poem here, Anthem for a Doomed Youth. The first 4 lines of which you're probably familiar. What passing bells for thee who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their last orisons. So what about our friend Kirchner, German youngster, up for the draft, of course. Germany was at war. And they had a mechanism whereby you could choose the unit to which you were assigned if you actually volunteered. So people caught on to that pretty quickly, and Kirchner volunteered to be a driver for the artillery. But within a week there, he was so shattered by what he observed that he was invalided out in a state of paralysis and sent to a psychiatric hospital. And for convalescence, he was sent home to his family in Berlin, where he did this painting of himself, self-portrait as a soldier. And in the background, you can see a painting that he'd done previously. And there he is, cigarette in his mouth, eyes staring aimlessly into the distance there. And significantly, his right hand is amputated in this picture for his fear that he would never be able to paint again were he to be wounded. He went back into the army again, but before long, again, he had a hysterical breakdown and could not cope and was temporarily discharged and sent to another mental hospital. And there he painted himself. He was at this stage addicted to the sleeping pills that had been described as a sort of sedative to calm his nerves. He was addicted to alcohol and nicotine. And here he paints himself as a drinker with this sort of otherworldly gaze and wearing this bizarre exotic scarf and, interestingly, high-heeled shoes, as if to say, who am I? And interestingly, his right hand is dangling down in Christ's gesture of a man of sorrows. Back in the army yet again, until finally they gave up on him and sent him to Dr. Sprungler's clinic in Switzerland. And there he was being treated for his neuroses and psychoses or whatever it was that afflicted him. But in 1917, he'd actually applied for permanent residency in Switzerland. And miraculously, the day the letter came granting him permanent residence in Switzerland, all his ailments disappeared. Another artist we haven't met yet is Max Beckmann, who went on to be one of the most respected of the German painters of the 1920s and 1930s. And Max was also a sensitive man, as most artists, of course, are. And he also volunteered, and he volunteered to be a driver, not for the artillery, but for the ambulance corps. He was so shattered by what he was observing at the end of the first week, he was discharged as unfit for service with a diagnosis of neurasthenia, which seemed a pretty good wheeze to be on if you knew the jargon, but that obviously got you out of the army. He couldn't paint for 2 more years as a result of that. But when he did, he painted this searing, claustrophobic, very dense painting called The Night. And in it, he sums up the feelings that he had during all that time. And let me just help you through it, because at first sight, it's a bit of a jumble, isn't it? But what we're looking at is 3 gangsters or crooks who've entered a very claustrophobic, small, hut-like room. And you can see just slightly to the right of the midline there, there's a girl with her legs splayed out, do you see? And her arms are above her head, tied to a window frame which has been pulled out, her legs splayed out, indicating that she has probably been raped. And on the very left of the picture there, you can see a man with his head over to the side there who is being strangled by the other gangster who'd come in with cloth around his neck. And at the same time, to add insult to injury, the man with the pipe at the top of the picture there in the middle is rotating his arm, doing that sort of searing thing to create the pain. And all along, the gramophone under the table there is issuing a silent scream. George Grosz, 21 years old, All these are young people, all drafted into the army, all responding in their own way to their experiences. But George Grosz was actually Georg Grosz. And Georg Grosz, 21 years old, a little bit older than the other people we've just met, there was a cartoonist, a young man full of self-confidence with a very strong rebellious streak. He was drafted into the army. There was no way he was going to volunteer, but he was fortunate in having chronic sinusitis, which got him out of the army in pretty short order. It was seen to be quite a genuine ailment. But not before he was almost shot for insubordination. So this gives you a little inkling as to how his mind worked. And as a consequence, he was well placed to observe the effect of the First World War on German civilian society. He was something of a bit of a dandy, and here he portrays himself sitting in a pavement cafe in Berlin. Again, that very steep perspective there to make you feel unstable. You wonder how those chairs are managing to stay on the ground at that sort of angle. And there he is in a sort of dandy-like suit, his arm draped casually over the back of his chair, holding a cane and a tattoo of an anchor on his head. He's bald here, and his heart is showing through his jacket, can you see there? But significantly, in his top breast pocket, he has a revolver. So this is the complex way he's looking at things, and he calls this picture lovesick, so for what it's worth. But as an observer, here he's reflecting in one of his cartoons the militancy that we saw. Do you remember we saw the English recruits there queuing up to enlist, jingoistic with their straw hats and their cloth caps? And here he's capturing the same sort of fervor for the war in Berlin, but going a stage further. The fervor wasn't just people lying up politely waiting to enlist and sign on and join up, but here the fervor is actually translated into fistfights among the citizens of Berlin themselves. And you can see that just about everybody there, there's a woman there being attacked in the middle, somebody's being hit. There's a collision between a van and a tram car. Can you see one poor hapless individual in the middle of the picture there, just above the middle, is falling out of a broken window. And at the back there is a church on fire. So this is German militancy carried one stage further. He was so distressed with how he perceived his countrymen becoming so militaristic that he formally changed his name from Georg Grosz to George, very English, and Grosz, presumably Hungarian, I'm not sure. And he went on, and here he did an oil painting in the same sort of vein, and he called this picture to Oskar Panizza. I'll tell you about him in a moment. It's a night scene, and you can see a throng walking down a very, very tight street. There's a building on the left that you can see in red. Difficult to sort out what's going on because it's all chaotic. A whole mob is thronging down this street, led by a priest in the bottom left-hand part of the picture, brandishing a white cross. You can see that. And if you look carefully at the bottom right-hand part of the picture, you can see a man blowing a bugle, others with trumpets, others with rattles. This is like a football crowd going to watch a cup final match. But the centerpiece of the picture is in fact a black coffin. Can you see that without my pointing? A black coffin surmounted by a jaunty skeleton, can you see here, drinking schnapps. And on the side of the building here, we can see Heute Tanze, dancing tonight. So this was his take of German society. Who was Oskar Panizza? He was a friend of Grosz, a fellow painter who refused the draft and was consequently put in a lunatic asylum until he came to his senses. And so this is the tribute to his colleague. And then there was Otto Dix, whose take on the war was completely different. He was the son of a foundryman, working-class lad, who was already enrolled when the war broke out in the Dresden Commercial Art School. He answered the call, was drafted, and stayed in the war much of the time in the front line for full years. He was a painter. He took with him into the war many sketch pads and produced by 1918 no fewer than 600 sketches that he'd made of his experiences in the war. And he prided himself on being objective. Unlike Grosz, who was a political animal, Otto Dix always prided himself as best he could to be objective as far as he could. Well, it's all very well being objective when you're suddenly in the front lines in a war, and here's his first self-portrait in uniform, self-portrait as a soldier, and clearly a searing experience even for him, and one can understand the reaction of the fellow artists we've just looked at a moment or two ago. He stayed in, as I say, for 4 years, much of the time on the front line, achieved the rank of sergeant and earned the Iron Cross, second class. He was fascinated in a detached way as far as he could be once the initial shock of warfare had worn off on him a little bit. Here, a painting he called The Cannon. And it was just the whiz-bang of all the explosions and everything else, trying to keep his emotions out of it as best he could, which he captured. And also you can see the gun itself with all the cogs and wheels. He was fascinated by the machinery of warfare. Again, trying to retain this objectivity. Here, by the next year, he paints himself again, but this time he calls this self-portrait as Mars, the god of war. So he's clearly now a hardened soldier. You can see his jaw there. Can you see it? Do you need help to work your way through the sort of Cubist vocabulary? I think you can see there his square jaw jutting forward, his bloodshot eyes, and the light gleaming off his helmet, whilst around him all hell is breaking out. And here, again, it's the flash that comes out of the muzzle of the cannon as the shell is launched that captivates him, which he likened as objectively as he could to the evening setting sun. And there is the flash, and there is the barbed wire and everything else. And this is how he portrayed the war. He was just absolutely fascinated. When asked about his war experience at this time, just shortly after the war, he said, "The war was a terrible thing, but I wouldn't have missed it for anything," which is interesting. Of course, at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918, the guns fell silent. But a month before armistice was declared, Germany was disintegrating politically. The government had fallen, the Kaiser had abdicated, and there had just a few weeks before that been a mutiny of the German Navy. The armistice was signed in a railway carriage, I'm sure you know, in a clearing in a wood in Compiègne in France. And civil society, once the war came to an end, almost broke out into civil war. The country was divided really down the middle, a bit like I'm having to deal with the American election and Donald Trump, heaven forbid. So you can imagine what it's like in Germany at the end of the war there. Germany was divided between those who felt that Germany should not have surrendered. After all, the Allies hadn't even invaded the country. It was a stalemate. And those who were only too pleased at the fact that the rightists were on the defensive, and that Soviets, administrative Soviets, modeled on Russia, the 1917 revolution, this is now 1918, were being set up all over German cities. And so there was this almost a civil war situation with assassinations on both sides. The government finally stabilized around February 1919 with a moderate socialist government finally in power, and things began to settle down, and the final peace treaty wasn't signed until June of that year, 1919, as you know, in the Palace of Versailles. And it seems appropriate that the actual signing took place in the Hall of Mirrors of Versailles, because the terms of the peace treaty were really illusory in terms of the reparations that were required of Germany. It was an economic ruin, and there was no way these could be repaid. The other parts of the treaty were, of course, that Germany was to be essentially almost entirely disarmed, that Alsace and Lorraine would be returned to France, and that all German overseas territories would go to the Allies. Most galling of all, and I think the most contentious clause in the peace treaty, was the clause of guilt, war guilt. And looking at that complex map of treaties and everything else, one can question whether Germany was really at blame for starting the war. It was almost inevitable, I think. And that galled Germans very, very much, particularly as they had lost 1/3 of their manpower over the 4 years. It was a period of intense privation, of course. Everything was short, food in particular, malnutrition was rife, and the mortality from the Asian flu epidemic, which was sweeping through Europe at the time, was higher than it would otherwise have been had the population been moderately well nourished. And for many families, the soup kitchen was the only source of food available. The discharged soldiers, of course, particularly those who had suffered amputations, were reduced to begging. And a soldier such as this, of course, even had there been employment available, would scarcely have been eligible. So this is the background now in which our artists who've come through the war, one way or the other, faced the society in which they were now living. In order to pay the reparations and essential imports into Germany, which was an economic ruin, the government reverted to a very simple device of printing more money. So much so that the inflation became hyperinflation, and I'm not sure what the next comparative is beyond hyper, but that was it, the world's greatest inflation ever seen, I think. One loaf of bread in 1919 cost 1 mark. In 1922, it cost 100 million marks. The government actually requisitioned 200 factories to produce the paper on which the notes could be printed. And all this amused no end George Grosz with his cynical, non-reverential eye of society. He was a leftist, he was a propagandist, and he was delighted that the Soviet Union had been established and the old regime had been displaced. So he went to Russia himself to see what a worker's paradise was really like, and of course came back thoroughly disillusioned. And so he set about recording what was going on in Germany immediately post-war. Grosz had no doubt as to who was responsible for the mess in Germany now, and it was the rightists, the military types. So the first thing he did was produce a series of 9 lithographs, which he bound in this folder, and this is the cover of the lithograph set, depicting military types in a very unfavorable light. And to add insult to injury, he entitled the series Gott mit uns. Now, Gott mit uns, God with us, is in fact a revered motto for the German royal family going back to the Prussian royal family 2.5 centuries earlier. A bit like Honi soit qui mal y pense for Britain. It's a respected motto, you don't mock it. And here he is mocking the whole business of German militarism. It cost him a libel suit, and he only just missed going to prison, was fined, the original plates were destroyed, and all existing copies were likewise destroyed. But undeterred, he goes on doing his cartoons, and here are a couple of military types there, gluttonously enjoying a meal there, as you can see, reminiscing about the war and the good times that were, and look at the mess we're in now. But meanwhile, the Freikorps militia at the back there is attacking the leftists in the street. People are being murdered, assassinated, all mayhem is breaking out, but they're doing very nicely, thank you very much. And here in a cartoon called 5 in the Morning, the same military types are enjoying the pleasures of the ladies, while the workers are having to trudge off to work, as you can see at the top of the picture there. And here he paints a picture which he calls Germany, A Winter's Tale. And that's the title of a poem by Heinrich Heine, who was exiled from Germany. And Heine, in his poem, was referring back to a Germany that was great and good before he was exiled. And here Grosz is using that same title, and he depicts what he sees as society around him now. You can see this German gentleman there brandishing his knife and fork at the dinner table in the middle of the picture there, like weapons, whereas in the foreground are 3 characters, as you can see, a clergyman on the left there raising his hand and blessing. The centerpiece, of course, is the military man, the general, and a teacher off on the right-hand side with a book there, The Pillars of German Society. But meanwhile, all chaos is prevailing around them, as you can see in the background. The whole thing is totally chaotic. And here he borrows a leaf from Giorgio de Chirico in his rather spooky cityscapes, you remember we looked at the other day. And he calls this Republican Automatons, his take on the way the citizenry accepted whatever they were told and did whatever they were told and wouldn't stand up for themselves. And there are 2 stalwart citizens who've been wounded in the war, amputees, as you can see. One of them totally effaced. All he's got is the number 12 replacing him. That's all he really was regarded. But jingoistically waving a national flag. And the one on the other side there, with a sort of mechanical device down there, proudly wears his iron cross on his lapel, but he's missing his brain, and out of the remains of his skull comes 1, 2, 3, hurrah! And here we have a German bourgeois with his nationalistic ribbon in his lapel. Can you see there at the front there? Significantly squint-eyed, because he can't quite see straight as to what's going on around him, wearing pince-nez. Interestingly, he's got dueling scars on his cheek on the left side there. And under his arm is a set square, suggesting that perhaps he's the architect of the wall that is separating him, quite comfortable, thank you very much, from the rest of German society in the background, the soldier there with the missing arm and another worker trudging off to the factory. And here in a picture which he actually calls the pillars of society, he doesn't mince his words here. At the bottom left there we can see a journalist, can you see, with a chamber pot on his head, and all the garbage that spilled out of the chamber pot has found its way onto the front page of the newspaper. To the right, in grey, can you see on the right-hand side this chubby-cheeked, flush-cheeked man with the top of his head missing, and we're gazing at his brain, which is excrement steaming away. And right at the very front is a military type with dueling scars on his cheeks again, a monocle, dressed very smartly in civilian dress, brandishing in one hand a sword and the other a mug of beer. And significantly, in 1926, George Grosz has put on his neatly tied tie a swastika typing, ahead of the game. And here the citizenry who are trying, the functionaries who are trying to get society to run. He represents in formal morning attire, but missing their heads, sitting around a baize table, as you can see there. Who dominates the scene, of course, is the general. There he is, flushed cheeks with all his medals and ribbons, in whose ear is whispering a capitalist. And Grosz calls this painting the eclipse of the sun, eclipsed by a dollar sign. So this is the values that he was observing in the society. And the poor hapless citizenry, that's the donkey with patch over his eye, feeding at the trough whatever's offered. Prescient Grosz was indeed. And in 1928, he does this painting called The Agitator. He doesn't put a little moustache on, but I don't think it requires very much imagination as to who he's representing. And the agitator is brandishing in his left hand there a rattle to attract attention. On the other hand, he's holding a bugle to attract attention to himself. There's a drum as well. And the crowd there on the right-hand side of the picture, all looking up at him, gobbling up everything he says. And he's promising, of course, all the things you can see at the top of the picture there. A lovely chicken, roast chicken, just come out of the oven. And what would seem to be a lady offering herself on the right. I've only just noticed that at the top there. I won't draw your attention to that. But what they didn't notice was that he had a truncheon around his arm, and there was a jackboot looming over his shoulder. 1928. 1932, Grosz was invited to give a course in New York at the Student Art League, and he went there, came back, collected his family, and in 1933, just before the appointment of Hitler as Chancellor, he went back to America and 5 years later became a citizen. And when he arrived in New York, he made this affectionate painting of the scene there, as you can see, Manhattan. Like most immigrants, he felt a little bit lost. And he was employed, he was able to paint a little bit, but everything had gone out of him. The spark that had fed him right from his youth, 21 years old, had suddenly disappeared. He was now in America without the push and pull of being in Germany. And this is a painting that he did at the time there, which he called Painter of Holes, Uprooted. And he paints himself as a little stick man with a brush in his mouth, as you can see. And the painting, it's a hole. There's just nothing there to paint anymore. And look around his studio, and all his paintings are holes with nothing much to report. What about our friend Otto Dix, who stuck it out stolidly throughout the war, a loyal citizen, sergeant, Iron Cross, second class. He was dismayed at the end of the war to discover many of his comrades who had been discharged, who had survived and been discharged, had joined Hitler's Freikorps militia. And not only that, had taken part in the 1923 beer hall putsch, which you remember Hitler with a few of his men marched into a large beer hall where a political meeting was taking place and announced that he had taken over the Munich government. 3 days of fighting took place. Hitler was arrested together with his other supporters. And this is a photograph taken just before Hitler's trial. And there he is, and standing next to him is General Erich Ludendorff, under whom Otto Dix had served in the army for 4 years, a respected general. The trial came up before a sympathetic judge who gave Hitler a minimum 8 months prison sentence, which he served out in great comfort, where he was able to write Mein Kampf, and Ludendorff was actually the charge against him of collaboration. Hitler argued that he was only doing this to save Germany, but Ludendorff was actually acquitted. So disillusion was setting in the mind of this loyal young man. And he looked around him at society. We saw that photograph of the beggar there with one leg, you remember, and somebody putting something in his hat. And this is Otto Dix's take of the same thing. It's a blind match seller. Can you see he's blind? He's not only lost one leg, he's lost 2 legs and 2 arms, just suspended around his neck. I'm not suggesting this was an actual scene, but this is how he depicted what he was observing in the street. And well-heeled passers-by, can you see there? All we see are their heels, to know they're well-heeled. They're ignoring him, and just to add insult to injury, the dachshund there is urinating on the poor fellow. How to depict all this? He wanted to be objective, yet he was shaken by what he was seeing had happened to German society. And he uses satire and whimsy, almost a frivolity here, to depict a couple of wounded war veterans. You can see one here at the back with a straw hat. You see, looking a bit wizened, a bit old for a war veteran, but he's lost all his limbs except one hand, which he has out. Can you see that palm outstretched on the left of the picture there? And dropping into his palm, you can see the hand above, a man with a green sleeve on his jacket with a gold cufflink. Is that visible there? And the man with the gold cufflink has dropped into the palm of the begging, jaunty man with his straw hat a postage stamp. The jaunty fellow in the front there is sort of, hello there, how are you doing? And there he is, you see, he's got his hat on a bit skew and he's got his moustache. He's looking as if he didn't have a care in the world, paddling himself along. He's lost the lower half of his body entirely. He's just riding over a newspaper which happens to say Juden raus. Cafe society, of course, has been with us since the 19th century, in Vienna and Berlin in particular. And here is just a normal cafe scene. 3 people sitting at a cafe table there, having their apple strudel and their coffee, playing cards, a game of skat. A little bit different. You can see the fellow on the left there is having trouble. He has no legs. He's got a peg leg. The other one is missing entirely. No, the other one, he has no arms. He has one peg leg, one good leg, which he uses as a hand to hold his cards. Can you see that on the left there? And in order to hear what his colleagues are saying at the table while waiting for the apple strudel to arrive, there's a little microphone on the table. Can you see that? With a blue tube going up into a hole in his skull where his ear used to be. But it doesn't matter, he's playing cards and he's actually got quite a good hand to judge from the grin on his face. The fellow opposite him there is loyally got his smart jacket on, a wing collar, and his iron cross prominently displayed on his chest, an artificial jaw, and he's lost his nose, but that doesn't matter. He's also got a pretty good hand, so the game is getting interesting. Whereas the fellow right at the back there, the white hair, the big face looking at us, has got a glass eye, you can see, also got a false jaw, and he has no hands. He's got a couple of peg legs, but no hands, so he's obliged to hold his cards in his teeth. Well, that's okay, but the game is going well and the coffee was good. How else to portray this? This didn't satisfy Dix. It was humour, all very well, satire, all very well, but it didn't seem right. So now he turns to a more savage note. And here he portrays Ellis, the brothel keeper. And Ellis, like anybody else, was trying to earn a living in these terribly desperate times. And he portrays her as a savage who's out for what she can get, for what it's worth. But then again, he was unsatisfied with that, and he wanted to back off. He wasn't a propagandist. None of these media, none of these styles that he had adopted seemed just right for the seriousness of the situation. And he backed off to this much more detached way of representing a brothel scene, which he called unequal lovers. And I think you would agree the bitterness has gone out of it, and there's almost a poignancy in that picture. In a way, it's like less is more. The triptych, of course, is a format of painting that goes back to the church, to the Renaissance, to the very early Renaissance, usually as an altarpiece, a large painting with a flap painting on one side, another flap painting on the other side. And it's a devotional work. And here Otto Dix uses the same semi-detached style that he just used in The Unequal Lovers to do a triptych which he calls City Life. And in the left-hand panel, we can see a wounded soldier there with two peg legs who's growling at a couple of prostitutes there, can you see on the right-hand side under this little bridge. And the question is, what is he thinking? Is he looking at them disapprovingly? Is he looking at them with lust? Or is he looking at them with understanding? On the right-hand panel, we have some high-class prostitutes. Look at this one coming down on the left there, with a blue streak in her hair surmounted by a little knob at the top, and wearing her long boa here for looking every bit like female genitalia. I'm sure we can't escape that conclusion. And behind her in the middle, a bald-headed, chubby-looking woman there with her bare breast. And at the bottom there, can you see next to the sort of Baroque marble stairway where they're coming down is a legless beggar who gives the girls, as they pass by, a salute. And there's the whole triptych. The left-hand panel we've just seen, the right-hand panel, a devotional work, if you like, homage to Berlin 1925. And in the center panel, we have those who are managing to do not too badly under the circumstances. Cabaret life was rife, after all, with hyperinflation. You might as well spend your money because tomorrow it's going to be worth half of what it was worth yesterday. And so there we see a couple strutting out doing the Charleston, you can see in the middle there. There on the left-hand side is a jazz band with its obligatory black drummer. A girl there with a pleated dress, a string of pearls around her neck, a flamboyant ostrich fan over her head. And right at the back on the central panel in blue is a languid-looking lady smoking her cigarette. So this is a tribute, a homage to Berlin 1925. And of course it was Kurt Weill and the Threepenny Opera that really led, which really summarized quite beautifully Bertolt Brecht's words, and Kurt Weill, classical musician incidentally, who composed the Threepenny Opera, which turned conventional morality on its head, for the cast were gangsters, not heroes that you would see in any other opera. And so that captured very nicely, and the film Cabaret with Nisa Minnelli captures very much that same essence. I'm sure you've seen it and can respond. 1929 is now 10 years after the war, and Dix had time to reflect on those dynamic, lively pictures that he'd painted on the front lines. And his war experience was now colored by what happened after the war, what happened to his fellows who were supporting Hitler. And now he does another triptych, which he calls The War. Now it's much more realistic. He's had time to sober up and absorb the reality of what he went through in its true perspective. And in the left-hand panel there, we see the soldiers going off into battle. And in the middle panel there, we can see a soldier in his gas mask, devastated terrain, another upended dead soldier there with his legs, can you see, up in the air on the right-hand side of that central panel. And on the right, he's pictured himself there rescuing a fellow wounded soldier. And interestingly, there's a predella, a sort of horizontal piece under the triptych there with a soldier lying. Is he sleeping in his bunk? Is he sleeping in the trench? Or is he sleeping for eternity? We don't know. 1933, Hitler wins an election because Germany was beginning to come back upon itself. Its economy was beginning to recover, 1928, 1929, and then the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression, so everything went back to where it was in the early years of the 20s. And I suppose, in retrospect, not surprisingly, under those circumstances, Hitler was elected, and here Paul von Hindenburg inaugurates him as Reich Chancellor. One of Hitler's first acts, of course, was to purge Germany of foreign influences, and of course the Jews featured in this pretty evidently. And that included removing all books by German authors, and that included Heinrich Heine, Franz Kafka, and Sigmund Freud, whose books were ceremoniously burnt, as you know. It also meant that any work by a Jewish composer was now forbidden, and that included works by Mendelssohn, Mahler, and Schoenberg, who were no longer allowed to be performed. And jazz, which was decadent Negro music, was also forbidden, but there was a problem. Everybody loved jazz, and there was no way. It's a bit like prohibition in the States, you know. It's a good idea in principle, but unenforceable. And that was the problem with jazz. So they relented. You could play jazz as long as you called it swing. Rather nice, don't you think? What about painters? And here's Otto Dix now, because there was also removal of paintings by any Jewish artist. That was an absolute given. So out of the window went Pissarro, Chagall, Soutine, whose pictures were all burnt. But also other so-called decadent painters, like the ones we've been talking about for the last 4 days. Oh, poor old Picasso was in there, Dali was in there, and even old Kandinsky. I mean, that's not really fair, is it? But there he was banned as well, together with other obvious decadents like Van Gogh and Matisse. Included among them were even German painters. Who were the German painters who were banned? Of course, Kirchner, Nolde, Beckmann, Grosz, and Dix. Dix was summarily dismissed from his teaching post at Dresden Art College without any notice. He was allowed, any artist who wanted to work, let alone teach, had to submit his work for approval. And Dix was dismissed from his post, but he was allowed to continue to paint as long as he only painted landscapes. And so he thought he would just test the water a little bit, a man of great integrity. Thought he would test the water, and he, rather than a pure landscape, he reverted to the German Renaissance and thought he might get away with this. And rather charmingly, he's pictured here young lovers. Can you see against the wall on the left there? And on the ground, on a little patch of grass, a baby crawling towards an old lady who's gesturing to pick him up. But next to the young lover girl, we can see a beggar on the ground there. Do you see an amputee with no legs there, looking up at the figure of Death, who wears a crown? And with Death's other hand, he has a scimitar with which he is embracing a soldier so that the soldier can do his work for him. So a political statement for sure, but he was testing the water to see if he can get away with it, and I don't know the outcome of that. Goebbels, of course, was charged with purging museums of all these works that we've just talked about. 16,000 works were removed from the walls of museums in Germany as a consequence. Many were burned publicly. Others mysteriously found their way to Switzerland, where they were auctioned, and yet others mysteriously found their way into the private collection of Hermann Goering and other members of the Nazi Party. Selected items from the purge of the museums were brought together for several exhibitions of what was called Entartika Kunst, degenerate art. And the most celebrated of these was in 1937, where pictures were collected for a traveling exhibition that went to 5 German cities. And it is estimated that during the 8 months of the tour, over 1 million people went to see the exhibit. And it was hung in a clever way. The pictures of these artists we've just been talking about, regarded as degenerate, were deliberately hung in the exhibition, unframed, suspended by a rough rope. Furthermore, at a jaunty angle, well, not a jaunty angle, a disturbing angle, because clearly the artist who produced them was disturbed, interspersed with which were works of art from inmates, or patients as we would now call them, of mental hospitals. And slogans were written on the walls of each room where these paintings were exhibited, most of them anti-Semitic in nature, linking everybody to the degenerate Jews. How did our friends react to this? Kirchner was among those whose works were banned. And yet he, of all people, as a youngster, wanted to link present-day art to the glories of the German Renaissance. And he was so distressed. He was living, remember, he was in Switzerland and had gained Swiss residency. And in Switzerland, on a winter's morning, he went out from his house and opened the door, went down through the snow to the garden gate, and there he shot himself in the chest. Let me just go back one. For Beckmann, he went into exile in Amsterdam, and 1947 went to the United States, where he took out American citizenship. Emil Nolde, who did that prophet, you remember the woodcut of the prophet, that searing picture of the prophet there? Emil Nolde was so shaken that he would be included among the degenerate artists that he appealed personally to Goebbels, saying that I have, for the last 10 years, been a member of the Nazi party, which indeed he had, but to no avail. And then that left George Grosz, who was already in America now with his family, who, when he learned that his works were included in the Degenerate Art exhibition, announced that he was proud to be in such distinguished company. And as for our hero, and I think the hero of this whole story must be Otto Dix, loyal young man, citizen, humble family, painted with integrity throughout, but couldn't but be seared by what he was seeing, who recanted the excitement of war for its reality, and who, at the age of 54, was surprised to find in 1945, as the Allies were closing in on Berlin, that he had received the draft. Why? Because everybody, children, old people, were all brought back into the army again because defeat seemed imminent. Within the week, he was captured by the advancing French forces and interned in a prisoner of war camp. And when he finally emerged in 1946, Otto Dix, the loyal soldier who observed objectively as he could what had happened to the society he had loved, painted this self-portrait. He went back to work in Dresden, which was now part of the People's Democratic Republic of Germany, Communist East Germany. The paintings that he was doing were nothing like socialist enough to please the government, so he didn't sell anything. And meanwhile, art in the West had moved on, so he was struggling really to make do. But slowly, slowly, he came to be recognized, and in 1950 received a medal from the federal government of Germany in appreciation of the contribution he'd made to German art. Well deserved, I think. He died at the age of 69, a man who felt disillusioned about what had happened to his country, but more importantly, feared that man would never learn from his past. And on that sobering note, we must stop. Thank you. Can I just make one announcement? Could you put the lights on, Angus, if you would? Thank you all for sticking it out. I've just been asked to mention that would you please fill up your evaluation form, and I filled up mine.